This is the Jesus is Borg slide. I don't know if you're familiar with the Borg from Star Trek, I guess it is. The Borg assimilate everybody, and I guess the insinuation on the Evolve Fish website, which tells us is that Christianity has assimilated other cultures. We'll leave the judgment for later. So sparked by this Jesus is Borg bumper sticker form on his wife's car, apparently another driver was so miffed about this bumper sticker that he actually forced his wife's car off the road to tell her how he felt. Shortly afterwards, in a Canadian Tire parking lot, another person took offense to the bumper sticker. When she mentioned that he ought to talk with her husband about these issues, since he actually talks about them in his lectures, he replied, "So you're one of those people." If by those people he was referring to those who defend the right to dissent, to speak freely and to proudly engage in mockery and criticism, the hallmarks of a healthy democracy, I only wish there were more of those people around. There's a freedom related to free expression that I wanted to touch on, since I have a related anecdote I wish to share, and that's the opposite. The freedom to opt out of participating, to opt out of expressing, especially when doing so puts you in the smallest minority. At a wedding reception of a cousin of my girlfriend's we attended recently, grace took place before the meal, and it was expected that all attendees would stand, bow their heads, and participate fully in this religious ritual. When my girlfriend and I chose respectfully to leave the room during this event, we were called disrespectful. Though we tried to explain our rationale in a reasonable conversational manner, the others at the table would have none of that. The idea here was that those getting married have the right to call all the shots, and everybody else is expected to fall in line. This is even more true at a religious funeral, in which it would be unthinkable to fail to honor the wishes of the grieving, regardless of one's personal beliefs and feelings. But isn't using one's position of authority to cower others into submission usually considered arrogant, an epithet usually hurled at atheists and doubters? This story will be part of a longer piece I'll be submitting to Free Inquiry magazine shortly on the whole issue of atheism and arrogance, as I see it. For present purposes, I'm trying to raise your consciousness as to the hypocrisy of the situation. While my girlfriend and I were only asking for others to respect our right not to believe, those at the table not only required our respect for their beliefs, but required us to participate in rituals designed around those beliefs. This is similar to the cry raised when members of an organization called Secular Ontario, an allied group of the Centre for Inquiry Ontario, tried to call on municipalities to give up on saying prayers at the opening to their town hall meetings. And similarly, when my U of T group lobbied U of T to do the same with graduation ceremonies. Again, we heard that it was disrespectful to remove this ritual since the majority of people believe in God. Now, as an aside, let's remember that the majority of people don't just believe in God, they still believe in Jesus Christ, and yet the prayer has been cleansed of that sectarian association. Once again, but besides that, once again, we do have people confusing two issues. Is it the case that the prayer only has an effect when said in front of a large audience? As in the unconstitutionality of school prayers, the issue isn't whether individual people shouldn't be allowed to pray at school, which of course they should be. I believe they should. But whether the rest of us need to stand, listen, bow our heads, or in some other fashion pay lip service to this ritual that demeans our belief system or lack thereof. The hypocrisy is yet even more apparent when one considers the sorts of accommodations now being asked by many Muslim and Jewish communities. There is the now pretty old issue of York University eliminating classes on Jewish holidays, forcing all students to de facto observe the holy days of another's faith. Now we have the Canadian Federation of Students Task Force on the Needs of Muslim Students. We have copies of that which we will pass out during the event. The Shriver can do that while I'm talking. Which is mandating all sorts of accommodations for Muslim students, from an end to interest fees on OSAP loans, to women-only swimming hours, to Muslim-only prayer space. This group of Muslim students expects male students to pay for female-only gym time, expects students of other faiths and of no faith to pay for Muslim-only prayer space, and expects presumably all taxpayers to help subsidize interest-free loans for Muslim students. Yet no one has absolved atheists of paying into the Multi-Faith Center, $4 million, or reduced an atheist student's tuition fees paid to student affairs, which partially subsidizes the chaplaincy office. I had a feeling this part would spark a phone call. This is my most offensive part of my speech. The task force report makes it clear that these accommodations could benefit everyone. After all, alcohol-dry colleges and banquets will be open to everyone. Women-only gym times are open, at least for the moment, to non-Muslim women. And Sharia-compliant loans, as we now hear are being instituted at some Canadian banks, might be of interest to non-Muslims too. But here's the problem. At some point I start to wonder who's accommodating who. Is Canadian culture accommodating Muslim wishes? Or are we instituting a Muslim system that is thankfully still accommodating to non-Muslims? The juxtaposition is striking, and this really goes to the heart of my point about how minority faith groups are now demanding more and more accommodations, while atheists and freethinkers are just asking for recognition of their existence and the right to opt out of rituals they find offensive, which ironically, opting out for the moment, might be an atheist's strongest and only way to be heard. But in Christian colleges where prayers are commonly spoken before meals, no one excuses from the room those like atheists who are uncomfortable with the prayer. Other examples of the ignorance of our community's existence abound. Secular humanists are not included in the U of T chaplaincy list of performers of weddings. Our attempts to work through the diversity office at U of T to stage events with faith groups has been completely ignored. In fact, the U of T diversity officer snubbed my invitation to the inaugural event of the Centre for Inquiry Ontario, even though the country's first centre for atheists came out of his own university. And atheists rarely get invited to multi-faith panel discussions on or off campus. As an example, the multi-faith panel being put together by Mayor Miller as we speak, I don't believe has any atheist or humanist representatives. But how can you truly have an open democracy in which all ideas are put out on the table when that table itself exists in a multi-faith center? In a multi-faith center, all views are open, so long as they are founded on a shared belief in a God as you understand him, kind of how AA works. When my organization opposed the U of T Multi-Faith Center, we said that it contravened the university's statement of institutional purpose, which states, freedom of speech, academic freedom, and freedom of research are meaningless, unless they entail the right to raise deeply disturbing questions and provocative challenges to cherished beliefs. I'd like to end here on a couple of positive notes, because although the Faith Center has been constructed and is shortly open for business, or maybe is by now, the stated purpose of the center actually does mention dialoguing with the non-faith community and raising the sort of meta-faith issues pertaining to conflicts between faith and non-faith communities. In this vein, our community has been promised participation in the governing of this center, and we do consider that a minor victory. Another related positive note I should mention is how the One School System Network, which Schreiber mentioned, a coalition of many groups dedicated to creating one public school system in Ontario. Peter standing there in front of the board, we do have a petition going around at the back and at the front table if you care to sign it. A coalition of many groups dedicated to creating one public school system in Ontario by ending the discriminatory public funding of Catholic schools, which was formed just last week at that table behind you. Actually, we took the table away. The table behind you that did exist, that's where we had that meeting. We had representatives from the Muslim Canadian Congress, from the Hindu Conference of Canada, from Education Equality in Ontario, under whose umbrella are several Christian groups, and of course many secularist and humanist groups came together too. This, I think, is a major development for the good of all communities in our province. And I hope it will create relationships and friendships, not just between faith groups, but between atheists and people of faith, that will carry over into other political and social campaigns. And on that note, I'm going to ask Schreiber to come back up and welcome our two other speakers. Schreiber, where do you want me to sit?
Should any of our other speakers care to review anything he says, that would be quite enjoyable. Our next speaker is Mr. Jawad Faizi. Mr. Jawad Faizi was a journalist from Pakistan where he worked on several newspapers and was the head of the Punjabi Union of Journalists. He immigrated to Canada in 2002 seeking political asylum. However, that doesn't seem to have quite worked out for him. Recently, Mr. Faizi was attacked in Mississauga outside the home of his editor by two men, one wielding a cricket bat, for comments he made about a group called Minhaj-ul-Quran. To be fair to the group, they've released a press statement that says that their mission is to promote a rational and scientific picture of Islam, and that they strongly believe in free expression on which this society is built. Mr. Faizi would care to comment on their ideas of free society. We'd like to hear that. So without further ado, please help me welcome him to the stage.